Brinkhaven used to be the kind of town where people left their doors unlocked at night, a place where kids rode their bikes down quiet streets, where neighbors watched out for one another, and where the police were seen as guardians of justice, not enforcers of fear. But that was a long time ago. Now, the streets grow silent as patrol cars pass. Conversations lower to whispers when the wrong name is mentioned. Store owners pay for protection, not from criminals, but from the very people sworn to uphold the law. And those who dare to speak out, they either disappear or find themselves behind bars for crimes they never committed. In Brinkhaven, justice isn't a right, it's a privilege, bought and sold by those in power. The officers who should be protecting the innocent have become the ones controlling the system. They decide who walks free, who rots in a jail cell, and who simply vanishes without a trace. There are no rules, no consequences. The law bends for those who know how to play the game. And those who refuse to play, they're taken off the board. Officer Jessica Mallory had always dreamed of wearing the badge. She believed in the law, in doing the right thing, in standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. She never questioned whether justice worked until she joined the Brinkhaven Police Department. At first, she chalked it up to miscommunication. A case dismissed for lack of evidence even when the proof was clear. A suspect mysteriously released from custody before trial. A witness recanting their testimony overnight, eyes filled with silent terror. But then the pattern became impossible to ignore. Jessica saw firsthand how justice in Brinkhaven wasn't broken. It was rigged. One day she questioned a fellow officer about a case where surveillance footage had mysteriously disappeared. He barely glanced at her before smirking. "You've got a lot to learn, Mallory," he said. "We don't enforce the law, we control it." A chill ran down her spine. This wasn't the job she signed up for. This wasn't about protecting and serving. This was a system built on power, corruption, and silence. And the unspoken rule was clear: fall in line or become the next casualty. Jessica was trapped between two impossible choices. She could stay silent, look the other way, pretend she didn't see what was happening, like so many others had before her. She could play the game, keep her badge, keep her job, and keep her head down. Or she could fight back. She could risk everything, her career, her freedom, maybe even her life, to expose the truth. But in a department where loyalty to corruption was rewarded and defiance was punished, she knew one thing for sure. If she made the wrong move, she wouldn't get a second chance. Jessica knew she couldn't stay quiet forever, but she also knew that once she took that first step, there was no turning back. So the real question was, would she stand up before it was too late? The call came in just after sunset. A routine disturbance near a convenience store. Nothing urgent, nothing out of the ordinary, or so Jessica thought. When she pulled up to the scene, the air was thick with tension. A man lay face down on the pavement, his hands cuffed tightly behind his back. His breathing was heavy, labored, his body tensed under the weight of an officer's knee pressing into his spine. His name was Marcus Green. Jessica stepped out of her cruiser. Around her, a small crowd had formed, keeping their distance, their faces a mix of fear and resignation. They had seen this before. Officer Donnelly, one of Kowalski's men, stood over Marcus with a look of smug authority. "What happened?" Jessica asked, keeping her voice even. "Resisted arrest," Donnelly said flatly. "Got aggressive when we asked for ID." Marcus groaned, lifting his head slightly. Blood trickled from a fresh cut on his lip. His eyes locked onto Jessica's, pleading, not for help but for recognition. "See me, see what's really happening." Jessica's pulse quickened. Something wasn't right. She glanced up, scanning the area. Across the street, a security camera blinked above the entrance to the store. If Donnelly was telling the truth, the footage would back it up. If he was lying, Jessica didn't argue, didn't push. She simply turned, walking back to her car, keeping her face unreadable. But inside, her gut twisted. She already knew what she was going to find. Hours later, with the station quiet and most officers clocked out, Jessica sat at her desk, fingers hovering over the keyboard. She pulled up the surveillance footage, pressed play, and watched the truth unfold. Marcus Green hadn't resisted. He had been standing outside the store, hands in his pockets, waiting. The officers approached. Words were exchanged. Marcus took a step back, his hands raised, non-threatening, open. Then Donnelly grabbed him. Marcus barely flinched before they slammed him against the wall. The takedown was instant, brutal. Fists flew, a knee drove into his ribs, his head hit the ground hard. Jessica swallowed, her throat dry. This wasn't just excessive force. This was an assault. She exhaled slowly, forcing herself to stay calm. Her hand hovered over the keyboard. She had two choices. Let it go. File the report as it was written. Pretend she never saw this. Tell the truth. She squared her shoulders. She hadn't joined the force to be complicit. Jessica logged the footage as evidence and filed a supplemental report detailing what really happened. Then she took the printed copy to her sergeant's office. Sergeant Cooper barely glanced at the file before tossing it onto his desk. "This is already handled, Mallory." Jessica frowned. "Handled how?" Cooper leaned back in his chair. "Green has a record. Some misdemeanors. No one's going to question a thing." Jessica's stomach churned. "That doesn't change what happened." "No," Cooper admitted, "but it changes how we write it up." A heavy silence settled between them. Jessica didn't move. She could feel it, the weight of unspoken authority, the warning that laced his words. She thought of Marcus Green, the blood on his face, the way he had looked at her. "See me." Her hands clenched at her sides. "This isn't right," she said quietly. Cooper's expression darkened. "Don't be stupid, Mallory. We do things our way here." That night, Jessica stayed late. She couldn't shake the feeling. This wasn't just one bad arrest, one altered report. This was bigger. She started searching the system. Other cases, other names, and the pattern emerged. Suspects arrested on questionable charges, all of them people who had spoken out against the department. Surveillance footage missing in key incidents involving police brutality. Witnesses recanting their statements overnight or disappearing altogether. Jessica leaned back in her chair, exhaling sharply. This wasn't an accident. This was a system, a machine, and the officers running it, they weren't just bending the law, they were controlling it. A sudden voice behind her made her jump. "You should stop." Jessica turned. Officer Dean Carter. A few years older, quiet, observant, one of the few cops in the department who still seemed to have a conscience. Jessica straightened. "What do you mean?" Carter glanced at her screen, then back at her. His voice dropped lower. "You think you're the first to notice?" His tone was careful, deliberate. "You think you're the first to try and fix it?" He let out a short, humorless laugh. "You can't change this system, Mallory. They'll grind you down until you either give in or you disappear." Jessica studied him. Dean Carter had once believed in something too. Maybe he had tried to fight back once. Maybe he had lost. But Jessica wasn't ready to lose. Not yet. And if they thought she was just going to look the other way, they had no idea who they were dealing with. Jessica had spent the last few nights digging into the past, trying to connect the dots. But the deeper she went, the more it felt like the walls were closing in. Files were missing. Reports had been altered. Names that should have been in the system were wiped clean. It was as if someone had gone through Brinkhaven's history with a scalpel, carefully cutting out pieces of the truth. She wasn't just up against corrupt cops. She was up against something much bigger. But someone else had noticed it too. She first saw the woman in the records room late one evening, dark curls framing sharp features, an air of quiet confidence about her. She moved with purpose, flipping through case files, always looking over her shoulder. Jessica had seen her before. She worked in records, didn't she? Tiana Rosewood. Something about the way she carried herself felt off. She wasn't just an administrator shuffling papers. She was watching, tracking something. Jessica started paying attention. Every time she accessed certain files, Tiana was there, somewhere in the background, observing. Whenever a case disappeared or a name was erased, Tiana would pause, almost like she was expecting it. At first, Jessica thought it was a coincidence, but coincidences didn't happen in Brinkhaven. One night, after the station had emptied out, Jessica decided to push her luck. She entered the records room, moving between the shelves, scanning through any case that had been tampered with. Footsteps. Jessica stiffened, tilting her head slightly. Someone else was in the room. She turned, but the space was empty. A flicker of movement. A file on the desk that hadn't been there before. Jessica stepped closer, heart pounding. A folded piece of paper lay on top. She hesitated, then picked it up. The handwriting was neat, deliberate. "If you really want to know the truth, meet me at cafe number 13. Jessica's fingers tightened around the note. She looked around the room once more, but Tiana Rosewood was gone. And suddenly, Jessica knew she wasn't alone in this anymore. Jessica sat in her car, staring at the dimly lit cafe across the street. Cafe number 13. It wasn't the kind of place people paid attention to. Tucked between a rundown laundromat and a bookstore that had been closed for months, it blended into the background, a place meant to be ignored. But not tonight. Jessica's fingers drummed lightly against the steering wheel. She wasn't sure why she was hesitating. Maybe because deep down, she knew once she walked through that door, there was no going back. A choice was waiting for her inside. One she wasn't sure she was ready to make. She exhaled, pushed open the door and stepped out onto the sidewalk. The cool night air did little to ease the tension winding in her chest. She crossed the street, her senses heightened, scanning for anything, anyone, out of place. The bell above the door chimed softly as she entered. The cafe was nearly empty. A single barista stood behind the counter, wiping down a tray with slow, practiced movements. The scent of stale coffee lingered in the air. And there, in the farthest booth, Tiana Rosewood was waiting. She wasn't pretending to look busy. No phone, no book, no coffee in front of her. She was just watching, waiting. Jessica forced herself forward, her heartbeat steady but her mind racing. She slid into the seat across from Tiana. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Tiana's dark eyes studied her, measured, calculating, but not in a way that felt threatening. More like she was assessing something. Jessica broke the silence first. "You left me a note." Tiana tilted her head slightly, amusement flickering across her features. "And you came." Jessica leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Who are you?" Tiana exhaled, resting her hands on the table. "I work in records," she said. "At least, that's what the department believes." Jessica stiffened. Tiana let the words settle before continuing. "I'm with the FBI." Silence. The words hung between them, heavy and unshakable. Jessica felt her stomach tighten. She had suspected something was off about Tiana, but this? The FBI? Here? She swallowed. "You're undercover." Tiana nodded, her expression unreadable. "For how long?" A small pause. "Long enough." Jessica's eyes flicked around the cafe, suddenly hyper-aware of every shadow, every customer who could be listening. Tiana must have sensed the tension because she leaned in, her voice dropping just slightly. "Relax. No one knows about this meeting but us." Jessica didn't respond. She wasn't sure she believed that. Instead, she focused on the one thing that mattered. "Why now? Why are you telling me this?" she asked, keeping her voice controlled. Tiana studied her for a moment, as if deciding how much to say. Then, finally, "Because you've been asking questions," she said, "and that's dangerous in Brinkhaven." Jessica felt her pulse quicken. Tiana continued, "After that report you tried to file, you made people nervous. You're at a crossroads, Mallory, and you need to choose carefully." Jessica exhaled slowly. She had known, the moment she refused to turn a blind eye, that she had put herself in the crosshairs. But she hadn't realized how closely she was being watched. She forced herself to meet Tiana's gaze. "The FBI is investigating Brinkhaven PD?" Tiana didn't blink. "Yes." Jessica clenched her jaw. She had spent nights digging through case files, seeing the pattern emerge, realizing how deep the corruption went. But hearing it out loud, that made it real. Jessica swallowed. "Then why haven't you shut them down?" Tiana exhaled, her fingers tapping lightly against the table. "Because we don't have enough. We know Kowalski is running things. We know the department is compromised, but we need hard evidence. Witnesses. Someone on the inside." Jessica's breath hitched. She knew where this was going. She could feel it. Tiana leaned in just slightly. "We need you, Officer Mallory." The words landed like a blow. Jessica didn't speak. She just sat there, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She could say no, stand up, walk away, pretend this conversation never happened. Or she could listen. And if she did, there would be no turning back. Jessica stared at Tiana, her pulse pounding in her ears. "We need you, Officer Mallory." The words should have felt empowering, like a call to action. Instead, they felt like a noose tightening around her neck. She glanced down at her hands, pressing them flat against the table to keep them from shaking. If she said yes, if she agreed to this, she wouldn't just be putting her career on the line, she'd be putting her life on it. She had spent years working to earn her badge, the academy, the long nights, the belief that she was stepping into something bigger than herself, something honorable. And now? Now that badge felt like a shackle. She thought of the officers she worked with. Some were outright corrupt, men like Donnelly and Kowalski, who thrived in the rot of Brinkhaven's system. Others were simply too afraid to fight back. If she did this, if she helped the FBI, she would be betraying them. No. She wouldn't be betraying them. They had already betrayed her. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to breathe evenly. She thought of Marcus Green, of the blood on his face, of the way his eyes had pleaded with her to see what was really happening. She thought of the names she had found in the system, the ones who had tried to speak up and vanished. And then she thought of herself. What kind of cop would she be if she turned away now? What kind of person? Her throat felt tight. She wasn't ready to die, but she also wasn't ready to become one of them. Jessica looked up, meeting Tiana's steady gaze. Her voice was quiet but firm. "What do you need me to do?" Jessica knew she couldn't just take the FBI's word for it. She needed proof, something tangible, undeniable, something that would force the truth into the light. So she started digging. Late nights at the precinct, long after most of the officers had gone home. Sitting alone in the dim glow of a computer screen, navigating a system that was built to hide secrets. She combed through arrest records, incident reports, financial transactions, looking for discrepancies, for trails of money that shouldn't be there. And she found them. Large, unexplained payouts, coded as operational expenses, but with no actual department records to back them up. Fines issued to small businesses for violations that didn't exist, only for those same businesses to magically avoid closure after a private meeting with Kowalski. Bribes, extortion. The whole system was a machine fueled by corruption. But files weren't enough. Jessica needed to hear it. She started wearing a wire, tucking a small recorder into the inside pocket of her uniform. It was dangerous. It was reckless. And if she got caught, there wouldn't be a second chance. But she had to take the risk. So she listened. She recorded. In the break room, she caught two officers joking about a false drug charge they planted on a guy who wouldn't shut up. At a bar near the station, she overheard a sergeant bragging about how easy it was to make cases disappear, as long as the price was right. The evidence was stacking up. For the first time, Jessica felt like she had control, like she was winning, until she realized she wasn't the only one paying attention. It happened in the locker room. Jessica had just finished her shift, still buzzing from the latest conversation she had recorded, a lieutenant discussing hush money with Kowalski over the phone. She had proof. Solid, irrefutable proof. She reached for her locker, ready to head home, when a voice stopped her cold. "You need to stop, Mallory." Jessica's blood ran cold. She turned. Officer Ryan Torres, one of the few cops she had actually trusted. For years, they had worked side by side. He had covered her on calls, vouched for her when she was new to the force. If there was one person she thought she could still count on, it was Torres. But the look in his eyes now, it wasn't friendly. It was tired, cautious, like he was standing on the edge of something dangerous. Jessica forced a small, controlled breath. "I don't know what you're talking about." Torres exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "Don't do that." He glanced around, making sure they were alone before stepping closer. "You think you're the first one to look into this?" His voice was barely a whisper now. "The first to try and change things?" Jessica clenched her jaw, her fingers curling around the strap of her bag. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. Torres sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. He looked defeated. "They will find out, Mallory. They always do." Jessica felt her chest tighten. She wanted to believe that wasn't true, but deep down she already knew it was. She swallowed. "And what about you, Torres?" He let out a short, humorless laugh. "I learned my lesson a long time ago." Jessica studied him for a long moment. Once upon a time, he had probably been like her, naive, hopeful, believing that being a cop meant something. Now, he was just another part of the machine. She should have been afraid. She should have backed down, but instead, a slow, burning anger settled in her chest. She wasn't done. Not yet. The night was quiet. Too quiet. Jessica pulled her jacket tighter around her as she stepped out of the station, the cool air brushing against her skin. The weight of the past few days sat heavy on her shoulders. Every step she took felt deliberate, cautious. Something wasn't right. The streetlights hummed faintly, casting a dim glow over the nearly empty parking lot. Most of the officers had already gone home. The only sounds were the distant hum of traffic and the occasional chirp of a night bird. She moved toward her car, slipping her keys from her pocket. That's when she saw it. A pair of headlights, about 50 yards away at the far end of the lot. Not moving, just sitting there. Jessica's pulse quickened. She kept walking, pretending not to notice, but her mind was already racing. Had it been there when she walked in? She couldn't remember. Her gut told her this wasn't a coincidence. She turned into the underground parking garage, stepping into the dimly lit space. The air smelled of oil and concrete, the kind of scent that clung to the walls. Footsteps, soft, measured, not hers. Jessica's grip tightened around her keys. She glanced around. The garage was mostly empty, except for a few cars parked in the back. Shadows stretched long beneath the flickering overhead lights. Her instincts screamed at her. She quickened her pace, heading for her car. Just as she reached for the door handle, a hand slammed onto her shoulder. Jessica spun around, but she was too slow. An arm snaked around her throat, pulling her back hard. She barely had time to react before a voice rasped against her ear. "You think you can take down Kowalski?" The voice was low, laced with amusement and a warning. Jessica gritted her teeth, twisting in the grip, but the man was strong. "You're just a pawn, Mallory. And pawns?" His grip tightened. "They get sacrificed first." Jessica gasped, fighting for leverage, her instincts kicking in. She drove her elbow back hard. A sharp grunt. His grip loosened just enough. She twisted free, stumbling back, her heart hammering against her ribs. For the first time, she got a clear look at him. Officer Gregson. A cop she had worked alongside for months. She had eaten lunch with him, covered shifts for him. And now he was looking at her like she was already dead. Jessica steadied herself, fists clenched. "Is this how it works?" she spat. "Threaten anyone who doesn't fall in line?" Gregson smirked. "It's not a threat, sweetheart." He took a step toward her. Jessica braced herself. Then, a sharp whistle cut through the air. Before Gregson could react, a blur of movement came from behind him. Jessica barely had time to register what was happening before a solid force slammed Gregson against the concrete wall. A grunt of pain, a struggle, then silence. Jessica's chest rose and fell rapidly as she stared. Tiana Rosewood stepped forward, brushing dust off her sleeve. She wasn't out of breath. She wasn't shaken. She just looked at Jessica, expression unreadable. "You okay?" Jessica swallowed hard, nodding. Tiana's gaze flicked toward Gregson, who groaned against the wall. She exhaled. "They're watching you, Mallory." Jessica didn't need the warning. She already knew, and now there was no denying it. They weren't just watching. They were ready to get rid of her. Jessica stood there, her breath still unsteady, the echoes of the struggle in the parking garage lingering in her mind. Gregson had tried to silence her, not warn, not scare, silence. She had always known this path was dangerous, but now there was no doubt. This wasn't just about exposing corruption anymore. This was survival. She looked at Tiana, who was watching her carefully, waiting. Jessica swallowed hard, her hands curling into fists. "I can't do this alone." Tiana nodded, as if she had been expecting that answer all along. "You won't have to." The decision was made. There was no ceremony, no formal briefing, just a quiet understanding between two women standing on opposite sides of the law, both wanting the same thing. Tiana gave Jessica a burner phone, a secure line. "You use this for anything sensitive. No calls, only messages. Never bring it near the station." Jessica took it, feeling the weight of what it meant. She was now a traitor in the eyes of her own department, a spy, a mole. She started slow, listening, watching, gathering. She played the role perfectly. Just another cop doing her job, just another officer ignoring the filth beneath the surface. But behind the scenes, she was feeding the FBI everything she could. Illegal payoffs, falsified reports, even names of officers who had crossed the line too many times to count. She found financial records showing how Kowalski had turned the department into his own personal business empire, funneling money through fake charity funds, skimming from city budgets. And then there were the conversations. Jessica kept the small wire hidden under her uniform, recording everything she could. Donnelly bragging about planting evidence. A lieutenant laughing over how many cases they had fixed. She passed everything to Tiana, one piece at a time. brick by brick. She was tearing the system down from the inside. Every day, Jessica woke up knowing she was one mistake away from being caught. She couldn't trust her colleagues, couldn't let her guard down, not for a second. She had no backup, only the FBI. And even then, she knew how these things worked. If she was exposed, there would be no cavalry coming to save her. No hero's rescue. She would disappear like the others. But despite it all, despite the fear clawing at the edges of her mind, she kept going. Because now, it wasn't just about Marcus Green. It wasn't just about the people who had been framed, beaten, or erased. It was about justice. The real kind. The kind that couldn't be bought, manipulated, or rewritten. And if she had to burn every bridge to get there, so be it. The courtroom buzzed with quiet anticipation. Every seat was filled. Reporters, community leaders, even a few off-duty officers. Some were here out of curiosity, others out of anger. But all of them wanted the same thing. To see if the untouchable could finally be touched. At the front of the room, seated at the defense table, Captain Raymond Kowalski leaned back in his chair, exuding an air of absolute control. He wore a tailored suit, better than what a city salary should afford, and a smirk that barely concealed his amusement. To him, this wasn't a trial. It was an inconvenience. Beside him sat his two most trusted officers, Lieutenant Donnelly and Sergeant Price. The men who had carried out his orders, silenced witnesses, buried evidence. If Kowalski went down, so did they. But looking at them now, none of them seemed the least bit worried. Jessica sat across the room, her fingers curled tightly around her notepad. She had spent months collecting the evidence that had brought them here. She had risked everything. And yet, Kowalski looked like a man who had already won. The judge entered. The courtroom rose, then sat. The proceedings began. Kowalski's lawyer, a man who had made a career defending the worst kinds of criminals, stood first. His voice was smooth, controlled, the kind of voice meant to plant doubt. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, pacing slowly. "What we have here today is not a trial." A pause, a knowing smirk. "This is a witch hunt." Jessica's jaw tightened. She had expected this, but hearing it out loud still made her blood boil. The lawyer continued. "My client, Captain Kowalski, has dedicated over 2 decades to serving this community. He has put criminals behind bars, cleaned up the streets, and, if I may be so bold, saved lives." Jessica clenched her fists under the table. Saved lives? This man had destroyed them. The lawyer turned to the jury, lowering his voice, like he was letting them in on some secret. "And now, because of a few accounting errors, the prosecution wants you to believe that this man, this decorated officer, is nothing more than a criminal?" He shook his head, feigning disappointment. "I trust you'll see through this charade." Jessica felt a knot form in her stomach. This was the game they always played. Not a single word about the victims, not a single acknowledgement of the ruined lives. Just deflection, manipulation, control. And judging by Kowalski's expression, he knew it was working. The lead prosecutor stood, buttoning his jacket before stepping forward. He moved with deliberate confidence, the kind of presence that demanded attention. "Let's talk about facts," he began. "Not theories, not distractions, just facts." He turned to the jury, his voice even. "The man sitting before you isn't on trial for accounting errors." He gestured to the evidence table, where piles of financial records, surveillance footage, and sworn testimonies sat waiting. He is on trial for conspiracy, for bribery, for obstruction of justice. A beat of silence. For weaponizing the very system meant to protect us. Jessica studied the jury. A few members leaned forward, taking notes. Others sat back, arms crossed. They were listening, but were they believing? The prosecutor continued. "For years, Captain Kowalski and his men ran this department like their own personal empire. They decided who walked free and who rotted in a cell. They lined their pockets while innocent people suffered." He paused, then looked directly at Kowalski. "But today, the law is no longer in your hands." For the first time, Kowalski's smirk faltered. It was slight, almost imperceptible, but Jessica caught it. For the first time, something cracked. The prosecution began laying out their case, financial records showing missing funds, backdoor deals, payouts that couldn't be explained. And yet Kowalski barely reacted. His fingers drummed lightly against the table, his eyes scanning the jury with bored amusement. Then, as the prosecutor flipped through another file, Kowalski did something that made Jessica's blood run cold. He laughed. It was soft at first, a chuckle, a quiet, knowing sound. Then he shook his head and leaned forward slightly. "Paperwork," he muttered, just loud enough for the jury to hear. The prosecutor stopped mid-sentence. "Excuse me?" Kowalski spread his hands as if the answer was obvious. "You think a couple of signatures on a page will be enough to bury me?" He leaned back, his smirk returning. "You have no idea how this game is played." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Jessica's heart pounded. This wasn't just arrogance. This was certainty. For the first time since the trial began, a thought crept into Jessica's mind. What if he was right? What if, despite all the evidence, all the work, all the risk, justice still wasn't enough? Kowalski sat in the defendant's chair, his fingers drumming lightly against the table. His smirk hadn't faded, not even when the prosecution laid out their evidence, financial records, questionable payouts, falsified reports. To him, this was a game. He had played it long enough to know the house always wins. Jessica sat across the room, hands clenched beneath the table. She had risked everything to bring this man to trial. And yet, Kowalski sat there untouched, wearing the same arrogance that had allowed him to thrive for years. But he had no idea what was coming next. 3 weeks earlier, the station had been empty, save for the faint hum of flickering fluorescent lights. Jessica's pulse pounded as she worked the lock on Kowalski's office door, forcing herself to stay steady. This wasn't courage, it was necessity. The door clicked open and she slipped inside, closing it softly behind her. The air smelled like leather and stale cigar smoke. On the wall behind the desk, framed commendations and photos, handshakes with politicians, awards for excellence in service. Jessica barely spared them a glance. She needed proof. She moved quickly, yanking open the bottom drawer of the desk. Then, bingo, a thin yellow folder marked with a single word, private. Her breath caught as she flipped it open. Inside, handwritten notes, wire transfer receipts, a list of names tied to dollar amounts, bribes. Jessica scanned the list. Not just dirty cops, judges, prosecutors, politicians. This wasn't just Kowalski's empire. It was an entire system. Her stomach twisted. If this got out, no. When this got out, it wouldn't just bring down Kowalski. It would shake Brinkhaven to its core. She snapped photos of every page, her hands moving quickly. Then she slid the folder back, exhaled slowly, and left. The moment the door locked behind her, she knew. This was the beginning of the end. Back in the courtroom, Kowalski was still relaxed, still untouchable, still convinced he'd walk out of here, just like he always had. Jessica's hands tightened around her notepad. Then, Tiana stood. She adjusted the microphone, her movements deliberate, then reached into her folder. "Your Honor," she said, voice smooth and steady. "The prosecution would like to submit one final piece of evidence." The judge gestured for her to proceed. Tiana lifted a small black recording device, pressing play. For a moment, static filled the courtroom. Then, a voice that sent a chill through the room. Kowalski's voice. "You don't get it, do you? We don't enforce the law." A pause. "We control it." Silence. It was as if the entire courtroom had stopped breathing. The jury stiffened. The reporters exchanged frantic glances. Even Kowalski, the man who had smiled through every accusation, froze. Jessica saw it happen. The exact second he realized he had lost. For the first time, his fingers stopped drumming. His jaw tightened. His eyes darted toward his lawyer, who for once had nothing to say. And in that moment, Jessica knew. The trap had snapped shut, and there was no way out. The silence in the courtroom stretched like a noose. Kowalski sat frozen in his chair, his usual arrogance stripped away in an instant. His fingers twitched, his jaw clenched. He had spent his entire career untouchable, weaving himself so deep into the system that the very idea of accountability had become a joke to him. But now the joke was over. Jessica saw it in his eyes, the flicker of realization, the undeniable truth sinking in. For the first time in his life, he had no control. He couldn't buy his way out of this, couldn't intimidate, couldn't erase, couldn't manipulate. This time, he had lost. The moment stretched, a second too long, a breath too heavy. Then, in a blur of motion, Kowalski moved. He shot up from his chair, knocking over papers, shoving past his lawyer. A deputy reacted too slowly. Kowalski lunged for the side exit. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The judge shouted, but the words barely registered. Jessica was already moving. Her instincts kicked in before her mind could process it. She bolted from her seat, shoving past stunned onlookers. She wasn't letting him walk away from this. Not again. The door slammed open. Kowalski was already halfway down the hallway, his broad frame barreling through the corridor like a cornered animal. Jessica pushed harder, her breath sharp, feet pounding against the floor. She wasn't letting him escape justice. Not this time. She caught up to him in the lobby. Just as he reached for the emergency exit, Jessica tackled him. They hit the ground hard, his weight slamming against the cold tile. Kowalski twisted, growling in frustration, but Jessica was faster, stronger, fueled by something bigger than him. He tried to throw her off, tried to shove her away like he had shoved aside every consequence, every ounce of guilt, every shattered life left in his wake. But Jessica wasn't backing down. She grabbed his wrist, twisted his arm behind his back, and snapped the cuffs around his wrists. The fight was over. Kowalski panted beneath her, his pride finally broken. Jessica leaned down, her voice low, firm, unshakable. Justice can be manipulated. She yanked him upright, holding his weight as he staggered. But it never disappears. The doors to the courtroom swung open, and the world finally saw him for what he truly was. Not a king, not a mastermind, just a man in handcuffs. And this time, there was no escape. The news spread fast. Kowalski, Donnelly, Price, all arrested. All facing charges that for once they couldn't escape. Brinkhaven had spent years under their control, but now the foundation of their empire had crumbled. Yet, as Jessica stood outside the courthouse watching the chaos of reporters and flashing cameras, she knew the truth. This wasn't over. Because corruption didn't die in a single trial. Jessica had done what many before her had been too afraid to do. And just like them, she paid the price. The station was different now. The whispers, the side glances, the tension in the air when she walked through the halls. She wasn't one of them anymore. To some, she was a hero. To others, she was a traitor. It didn't take long before she got the message. She couldn't stay in Brinkhaven. She had burned too many bridges. Too many people still in power wanted her gone. So she left. Not in disgrace, not in regret, but because her fight wasn't here anymore. 1 week later, Jessica sat alone in a quiet diner, stirring a cup of coffee she had barely touched. The exhaustion weighed on her, but for the first time in months, she could breathe. That's when she heard the voice. "Officer Mallory?" She looked up. A man stood in front of her, Marcus Green. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, slowly, he smiled. "I just wanted to say, thank you." Jessica blinked, taken aback. He wasn't just thanking her for his freedom. He was thanking her for all of them, for everyone who had been silenced, framed, beaten, erased. She swallowed hard, nodding once. "Take care of yourself, Marcus." He smiled again. "You too." And then he was gone. Jessica exhaled. Maybe she wasn't a cop in Brinkhaven anymore. Maybe she never would be again. But she had done what mattered. Later that evening, a reporter caught up with her outside the courthouse. Microphone in hand, camera rolling, he asked the question that had been on everyone's mind. "Do you think you've won?" Jessica looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned, looking straight into the camera. Her voice was steady, unshaken. "No, this is just the beginning. Justice doesn't come on its own. It has to be fought for, every single day." She held the reporter's gaze for a second longer. Then she walked away, because the fight wasn't over. It never was. Top of form, bottom of form.